Okay, well, this morning's final panel will be our deterrence panel. It'll be led by Dr. Terence Roehrig from the NSA department here at the War College. So, over to you.
All right, thank you very much. And it is a pleasure to be here and to be the moderator for our panel on a very, very important topic. Deterrence is a core element of U.S. national security, from strategic nuclear deterrence to defend the homeland, to extended deterrence, where we seek to deter and protect allies and partners. Deterrence is all over every U.S. national security document. But many people are raising questions about deterrence and how it operates in a new security environment, as a number of different issues are causing concern that perhaps we need to rethink about some of the ways we look at deterrence. For example, with Russia modernizing its nuclear arsenal, China modernizing and expanding its nuclear arsenal, how will strategic deterrence work when the United States now has two major peer competitors to deter simultaneously, as opposed to the Cold War when it was bilateral? What are the motives behind Chinese expansion and modernization, and what impact will that have on deterrence and future U.S. security? How should the United States and others go about trying to deter China from perhaps moving against Taiwan? And lastly, how are all of the new types of technology, as we just heard in the previous panel about AI and others, how do these new technologies impact potentially deterrence in the future? We are absolutely lucky to have four top experts with us today to be able to sort out these issues and address some of these very difficult questions. Their detailed biographies are in your program, but I'd like to just introduce the four briefly with a few of the highlights and which of the particular subjects they will be addressing. First of all, joining us online is Amy Wolf, who is a consultant specializing in nuclear weapons and arms control policy after an impressive 30-plus year career as the lead analyst at the Congressional Research Service on all aspects of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons policy. She will be addressing the topic of the impact of two nuclear peers on U.S. deterrence. To my left, Dr. Melanie Sisson, who is a fellow at the Brookings Institution in the Foreign Policy Program at the Strobe Talbot Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology. Her research focuses on the use of the armed forces in international politics, U.S. national security, and defense applications for emerging technologies. She will be presenting on deterrence and the Taiwan Strait. Next is David Logan, who is an assistant professor at the Fletcher School for Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in Boston. His research focuses on nuclear weapons, deterrence, and U.S.-China security relations. He will be talking about the Chinese nuclear expansion and modernization issue. And lastly, we have Eric Lynn Greenberg, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at MIT, also in Boston, where he directs MIT's war gaming lab. His research addresses how emerging military technology affects conflict and the use of force. He was an active duty Air Force officer and continues to serve in the Air Force Reserve. He will be addressing the issue of technology and the future of deterrence. So let me turn the microphone over to Amy, who is again coming to us from Zoom. We hope to have some very robust presentations here, and then we will turn it over to you for some stimulating discussion here. So Amy, it's all yours.
Thank you. I'm assuming everyone can hear me. If I can get a thumbs up. Good. Okay. First, I want to thank the Naval War College for inviting me to participate. The conference has been fascinating thus far, but I do sincerely apologize for getting caught in the weather upsets on Tuesday night and not being able to join you. My plan this morning is to talk about deterrence theory, not force structure and employment guidance, but how we should think about deterrence in an environment with two nuclear peer nations. I absolutely will not detail or bore you with U.S. forces and modernization plans, but don't worry, I promise, because this is the Naval War College, I will say slick 'em in before I finish. The issue of the impact of two nuclear peers on deterrence is really two separate questions. First, what is different about a world with two nuclear peers as opposed to just one with the Soviet Union? And second, more importantly, what do you mean by deterrence? So first, what's different about the two-peer world? Obviously, we have two global powers with enough nuclear weapons to challenge and attack the United States and our allies and partners. And obviously, if you have two countries with those capabilities, you have more targets to cover with US nuclear weapons. But more important than the numbers of countries and weapons is that in this environment, there are more potential scenarios for conflicts that might lead to nuclear use. It's not just a question of two sequential conflicts or simultaneous conflicts, or even the phrase that pays in Washington these days, opportunistic aggression. It's also the greater range of pathways that could lead to nuclear use. The question is, does this change US nuclear strategy? More countries, more pathways? Or the goals that the United States would seek to achieve through nuclear deterrence? Or the US nuclear requirements? I'll come back to the requirements issue a bit later, but to answer the first two questions, I need to know what you mean by nuclear deterrence. US nuclear strategy, now and during most of the Cold War, is to hold at risk critical targets valued by the adversary with forces that are both numerous and capable enough to convince the adversary that he will not achieve the perceived benefits of initiating a crisis or conflict, and that the costs of doing so will be unacceptably high. This is what Dr. Klein referred to yesterday as affecting the decision calculus through both denial and punishment. But affecting decision calculus is a mind game, not a simple weaponeering problem. It's also not a yes or no question for the adversary. Yes, 100% I'm going to shoot today. No, 0%. We are trying to manipulate the adversary's risk calculations at the margin. This matters because if we were trying to make a difference between 0 and 100%, we might look for the one single shiny object that could convince the adversary to stay at no. But because we're trying to manipulate risk at the margin, there are a suite of tools that we can apply to move the needle and to try and hold it below the 50% chance that today is the day. So we're not trying to go between 0 and 100, but maybe more between 45 and 55 at the margin to deter today. So for many in the nuclear strategy world, the question is, how many weapons do we need to place on how many and what kinds of targets to convince the adversary that the war will be a devastatingly negative experience? At one end of the spectrum, there are those who say we need enough warheads to destroy all critical targets promptly or even preemptively. Let's call this the maximum damage limitation strategy. So when China builds 300 new silos, we need 600 new warheads. Or we need more warheads than both China and Russia combined, not only so we are the biggest nuclear power, but also in case they team up together and we have to deter both at the same time. This is not how we do nuclear strategy. This arithmetic is unattainable, unsustainable, and arms race destabilizing. It's also not consistent with the goal of holding at risk the targets that they value, not preemptively or destroying all of them at once. At the other end of the spectrum are those who say we need just enough nuclear weapons that can survive a first strike and retaliate with unacceptable consequences against an adversary. Let's call this a minimum deterrence strategy. This is also not consistent with the US deterrence strategy. Maintaining forces sufficient in number to survive and retaliate is a part of the US strategy, but the need to threaten valued targets in sufficient numbers goes beyond minimum deterrence. Minimum deterrence also lacks credibility, particularly in the current security environment. If our answer to any nuclear use by an adversary is that we will unload all our surviving warheads against your territory to create unacceptable consequences, the adversary may not believe it. It's not credible if it's highly disproportionate to the attack and if they believe we don't have the stakes in the conflict to risk retaliation against the United States. And stakes in the conflict are really important in the current security environment. Central to both of these deterrence strategies is that they essentially assume the nuclear war is a central war between the United States and one or both of these adversaries. It is a debate about what we should do when we reach the nuclear precipice, without any consideration of how we reach the nuclear precipice. This is the kind of war we expect to see during the height of the Cold War, but it is not the type of war we expect to see now. And deterrence is not just about who you want to deter, but what you are trying to deter them from doing. Yes, we want to deter Russia and China from waking up one morning and lobbing nuclear weapons at us. But remember, the difference about the two-peer environment is that there are a greater range of pathways that could lead to nuclear use. And the challenge in this environment is to deter the lower-level crises and regional conflicts that could escalate to nuclear use, to deter nuclear escalation amongst this range of other pathways. Building on yesterday's opening address that we heard, we should not be preparing to deter the last war. Let's stipulate that today's nuclear war is one that evolves out of a conventional regional conflict, where one or two of our nuclear peers either threatens nuclear use against our allies to get them to break away from us and submit to them, or threatens nuclear use against us to get us to back out of the conflict zone and abandon our allies, or threatens nuclear use against their adversaries if it is failing to achieve its objectives in a conventional conflict. Let's call this a coercive first strike threat, or conventional war under a nuclear shadow, or an escalate to de-escalate strategy. The goal of the adversary's nuclear threats or its nuclear use is to affect the shape and outcome of a conventional conflict. This is like the seed war we heard about yesterday. If we, China, withhold all the seeds you need for your agriculture, there'll be riots in the streets and you'll go home. Today it's, if we, China, threaten to nuke Los Angeles and you really don't care about this conflict, you'll go home. The challenge for the United States in this two-peer environment is not about what weapons we will place on which targets once we reach that nuclear precipice, but what we need to do to convince the adversary that starting the conventional conflict and relying on nuclear weapons and nuclear threats to shape it will not end well for them. So what do we need to do to deter the start of this regional conflict under a nuclear shadow? The first thing we need to do is maintain robust conventional forces, not only to prevail if the conflict does occur, but also as a deterrent to convince the adversary that this is not a fight they want to start, and to tell the adversary that the fight will not be easy. Second, second most important, but even maybe the most important thing we need to do is maintain, secure, and bolster our alliances. This is both to bring the capabilities of our allies to the fight so that we can convince the adversary that it will not be easy, but also because the United States has to reassure our allies that we will be there for them in this fight so that the coercive first strike threat strategy of the adversary will not succeed. These two things combined have had a significant effect on the trajectory of the war in Ukraine. Russia was obviously surprised by the NATO response, which included both providing weapons capabilities to Ukraine and the cohesion of NATO in this response. Russia issued nuclear warnings early in the conflict to try and restrain this response, and it didn't work. So instead of a cakewalk into Kyiv, Russia is now more than 2 years into a conflict against an alliance that is holding together and conventional capabilities that are denying them an easy win. We're also trying to build up our conventional capabilities and alliance cohesion in the Indo-Pacific, and this is central to our deterrence goal here. We've seen deterrence dialogues with South Korea and Japan, even three-way dialogues between the United States, South Korea, and Japan, bolstering our alliances, our partnerships with the Philippines, and of course the big one, AUKUS. So nuclear weapons are a part of the calculation, because if the adversary is trying to shape the conventional conflict with the threat of nuclear escalation, We need to let them know that escalation, either as a threat to get us to withdraw or as a strategy to achieve victory, will not work. So we need that deterrent capability before the conflict starts, so it fits into their calculation at the lowest levels of conflict and not just when we reach the nuclear precipice. But what we need is not based on a simple arithmetic calculation of putting warheads on targets. It's based on the deterrent effect of maintaining the capability to convince the adversary that he can't escalate his way out of a failed conventional war. And right now, the Pentagon is conducting a strategy-driven review of the implications of this new security environment to determine what capabilities and posture we need in this environment. I don't have the results, but I do have some hints about what's going on. Numbers are part of this picture. We may need more nuclear warheads because there are more targets to hold at risk. But we don't need more warheads than both nations combined, both Russia and China combined. Several administrations officials have said this recently and over the last couple of years. As Vipin Narang, Assistant Secretary of Defense, said last week, we do not need to numerically pace our competitors warhead for warhead or outnumber their combined total of forces to deter them. Instead, he said, we are committed to fielding only what is required to credibly deter our adversaries and protect the American people and our allies and partners. Hold at risk, not maximum damage limitation. So in the near term, at least, there are options to increase the future capacity of existing launchers to carry additional deployed warheads. Because we do have the program of record for modernization underway, we really can't accelerate that program or add the numbers of delivery systems until the end of that program in the 2030s. But in the near term, we can add warheads on land, at sea, and to the air legs that could offer the national leadership increased flexibility. These are putting more warheads on ICBMs, more missiles on the submarines, returning some of the converted bombers to nuclear missions, things that we did under the New START Treaty, we can begin to undo in the near to midterm. But capabilities are also key. The Indo-Pacific creates a vastly different environment than Europe and therefore different requirements. Particularly, there's more ocean and less land, more distances to travel, and more significant integrated air and missile defenses. So the one thing to consider, according to Dr. Narang, is that we're trying to give the president options for limited nuclear responses in these circumstances of nuclear war under the conventional war under the nuclear shadow and the potential escalation. We can't just rely on our strategic nuclear forces because we don't want to make a disproportionate threat that is incredible. We may also want to be deployed in the region because of the distances, but also because we don't want to generate forces in a conflict and invite preemptive attack by the adversary. We want them to be survivable to avoid preemption. That seems to say it needs to be under the sea. And we want to minimize the risk of miscalculation by the adversary if we do use these weapons by not having it look like the first phase of a global nuclear war. And to get to the jargon, SLICM-N, the nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile, seems to respond to most of these prompts. STRATCOM and the Joint Chiefs of Staff have stipulated a requirement for a non-visibly generated, i.e. already in the region, non-ballistic, i.e. cruise missile, lower yield nuclear capability. And also because, as I mentioned earlier, there are more targets because there are two countries, you don't want to have to rely on your strategic forces or your triad for regional deterrence because that might leave strategic targets potentially uncovered. It also increases the risk of miscalculation if you're using a strategic platform for regional deterrence, particularly if it's against China, but also against North Korea. So this is where the support for the sea-launched nuclear-armed cruise missile comes from. But in just one last point, it's not the only option. We can use air-delivered systems as well, and it brings costs to the Navy. As Dr. Narang noted last week, it comes at a conventional cost to the conventional Navy. You're taking up space on your submarines or your sea-based systems, but the security environment has continued to deteriorate in ways and probably more rapidly, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, than we previously determined. So that's what we need to maintain deterrence in a two-peer nuclear environment, where there are multiple pathways to nuclear war, and nuclear war is likely to evolve out of a conventional regional conflict. We need conventional capabilities, we need robust alliances, and we may need some increase in the numbers and capabilities of our nuclear arsenal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That is a great opening and a good setting the table for a lot of important issues. So now, Melanie?
Thanks very much, Terry, and thanks for having me here. It's always a pleasure. There's going to be some touch points between what Amy so nicely put before us and what I have. My topic, of course, is deterrence in Taiwan, and I have to say, after listening to this morning's panel on AI, I felt relieved that I had the comparatively easy topic. Deterrence in Taiwan. I'm going to see if we had a slide come up. If not, that's okay. It exists there. All right, I'll look at the reflection. Thank you. Okay, so some baselining, of course. China and Taiwan disagree about Taiwan's international political status. Beijing believes Taiwan is the jurisdiction of the Communist Party of China. Taipei believes Taiwan is the jurisdiction of its own democratically elected government. The United States acknowledges their disagreement and in policy doesn't support the position of either government. For decades, the U.S. interest has been in maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. U.S. policy is guided by this interest and seeks to create conditions that make it possible for the cross-strait dispute to be resolved peacefully and in a manner that reflects the will of the Taiwan people. To achieve this, the United States has for decades worked to deter Taiwan from claiming formal independence and to deter China from using force in an attempt at unification. Policymakers have long assessed that deterring China requires threatening Beijing with the possibility of U.S. involvement in defending Taiwan against any direct use of force. But defending Taiwan is not a singularly military problem with a singularly military solution. And so I appreciate that the subtitle that I got to work with today is more expansive than that. The framing of deterrence in Taiwan, I think, invites consideration beyond military dynamics alone. And so I don't intend to focus on the correlation of forces, on how to make Taiwan a porcupine, on China's military modernization or ours, or on how likely it is or isn't that Beijing will act forcibly against the island today, tomorrow, before 2027, or ever. Instead, I want us to spend this time first briefly considering what deterrence is and what it requires, and then applying those concepts to what the United States will need to do to effectively and responsibly forward its interests in maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. So Google tells me that the definition of deterrence is the action of discouraging an action or event. You couldn't tell, but I pushed a button, and so I'm waiting for that. There we go. Okay. So deterrence is an action. It is to do something, which makes it a verb and not a noun. And as a verb and not a noun, we can't buy it. Deterrence isn't an object, a thing that we can possess. We can't have more of it or less of it. It's not something that can be stronger or weaker, reinforced, restored, or reestablished. But because it is an action, it is something for which we can develop a strategy. We can design a strategy to deter and therefore have a strategy of deterrence. That strategy, as Google noted, is meant to discourage another actor from acting. It's meant to persuade that actor not to behave in a particular way, at a particular time, and in a particular place. It does this by coercing that actor with bribes, which are more politely called positive inducements, gains, benefits, or carrots, and with negative incentives, most commonly referred to as punishments, consequences, lost, costs, or sticks. Making promises and threats are efforts to convince the other actor to behave in the way that we prefer, not to make them behave in the way we prefer, but to convince them. Coercion doesn't impose our will. It lets the other actor decide what to do, whether to comply with our wishes or to defy them. There we go. Because the other actor owns that decision, because it gets to choose whether to comply or to defy, every strategy of deterrence is probabilistic. That means there's some chance it'll work, and there's some chance that it won't. We can't make sure that deterrence holds because it isn't up to us. What we can do is work to design our strategy of deterrence in ways that we have reason to think will increase its likelihood of being effective at convincing that other actor to comply. We can use analysis of that actor's interests, values, constraints, and vulnerabilities to inform our choices about what to promise and what to threaten, and with which tools. An effective strategy of deterrence will take that empirical foundation and apply it in ways that are disciplined and purposeful in coercing along 3 lines of effort: displaying capability, exercising restraint, and conveying credibility. Not an iron triangle analogy about trade-offs, and it's not a bar stool analogy about balance. These are 3 independent elements, each of which has to be managed skillfully individually, and all of which have to be coordinated well together. The capabilities of use in strategies of deterrence aren't strictly military. We very regularly use our powerful economic and diplomatic capabilities to deter. But the display of military capability has been central to the ongoing debate about deterrence in Taiwan, and that's for good reason. Most analysts have concluded that in the absence of a military disincentive to use force, Beijing is likely to do so, and to do so with a modernized military that is now locally quite substantial. This doesn't mean that our efforts to deter will fail, but it does mean that we aren't able any longer to think that we can win any and all cross-strait contingency. And recognition of this fact has alarmed some in the U.S. national security community, and so the debates about how best to display U.S. military capability in Washington and elsewhere have become quite lively. But the ability of the United States to display military capability isn't the most problematic feature of deterrence in Taiwan today. It's less problematic, actually, than a decline in the willingness of the United States to exercise restraint. U.S. involvement in the dispute between Beijing and Taipei about Taiwan's international political status has been governed for decades by the One China policy. And it's a policy that does 2 things. First, it acknowledges but doesn't accept or agree with the PRC's view that there's one China and that Taiwan is part of China. And second, it establishes the U.S. intent to continue to engage in unofficial relations with the island's government and its people. The One China policy has endured for decades because it provides sufficient flexibility for the United States to retain close ties with Taiwan's civil society, to encourage development of its democracy, and to support Taiwan's acquisition of defense kit. And for decades, the United States has done these things in ways that avoid unnecessarily aggravating China's fears about U.S. support for the formal independence of Taiwan. Demonstrating this kind of restraint is essential to deter Beijing from resorting to force. It gives Beijing reason to believe that using force isn't its only or its best option for managing its own geopolitical and domestic political interests and imperatives. When the United States isn't mindful of this, when we say and do things that agitate China's anxiety about U.S. support for Taiwan independence, our behaviors get factored into Beijing's assessment of the ratio between what it has to lose by maintaining the status quo and what it has to gain by using force. The United States, we've become decidedly less disciplined over the last few years in exercising that kind of restraint. But the decline in our attentiveness to exercising restraint also is not what I think is the most problematic feature of deterrence in Taiwan today. That dubious honor instead goes to the matter of conveying U.S. credibility. The problem with credibility is that it's not real. It's a noun, but it's an intangible noun, untouchable and abstract. It's a perception. It's another actor's perception. And that doesn't mean we don't have any agency, but it does mean that we have to treat credibility for what it is, which is an effort to tell another actor something about ourselves and to give that actor reason to believe it. A good strategy of deterrence generates perceptions of credibility in 2 ways. First, by using empiricism to consider what we can do, and second, by managing downside risk to decide what we will do. Using empiricism simply means taking observable evidence as the basis upon which to select our ways and means. It involves seeking and using as much quality information as we can get about what the target of deterrence values and how much. And it involves assessing means and operations against their ability to access what the target values, against their ability to act upon what the target seeks to gain and on what it prefers not to lose. The question we have to ask ourselves, in other words, is do we know what to promise and threaten, and do we have the tools to make good on those promises and threats? Most people don't have any difficulty agreeing that empiricism is the right basis for strategy, and certainly they very often believe that empiricism is guiding their own assessments of what the target values, and therefore their own assessments of which means and operations are most likely to be effective. If you visit Washington, D.C. these days, you may notice that there is no shortage of experts on the id and ego of Xi Jinping and what he ate for breakfast and what he will and won't do that afternoon. Managing downside risk, on the other hand, means coupling assessments of what we can do with an accounting of the consequences each alternative set of means and operations produces when it fails to deter. Downside risk is the price of following through on the promises and threats our strategy of deterrence makes and accepting the costs it imposes on us when we do. Downside risk and its role in conveying credibility doesn't tend to be addressed directly. Debates often overlook it. They conflate it with displaying capability, and they seeming to think that evidence of our ability to do something is sufficient to convince the target that we will. Or they make claims that credibility is conveyed through one's record of past performance, that, for example, the U.S. response to Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukraine suggests something about how we'll respond to an unprovoked attack on Taiwan. But the essence of credibility isn't power and it isn't precedent. It is that downside risk. Credibility is the outcome of the target believing that we're committed to suffering the costs our strategy of deterrence will inflict on us when it fails. We have to assume, in other words, that the target begins with its own assumption that the relationship between the strategy of deterrence that we choose and the consequences that we accept is linear, that low alignment of our values, principles, incentive structures, and instrumental interests produces strategies that aren't very cost-acceptant, and that high alignment of our values, principles, incentive structures, and instrumental interests produces strategies that are. Defense alliances exist to make it easier for the target to believe that the alignment between strategy and consequence is high. And yet, even with defense alliances, we worry about being disbelieved. We worry that the target judges us not to be ready, after all, to trade New York for Paris. Just as the presence of a defense alliance doesn't automatically convince the target of high alignment, neither does the absence of a defense alliance automatically lead to the conclusion of low alignment. But it does make it even more difficult for the target to believe high consequence strategies. And this is the dilemma the United States faces with the Taiwan question. We don't have a defense alliance with the government of Taiwan. We do want Beijing to believe that we're committed to paying a high price if it chooses to rupture peace and stability by attempting to resolve the cross-strait dispute by force. And so we need a strategy of deterrence that aligns our values, principles, incentive structures, and instrumental interests with downside risk in such a way that Beijing is more likely to believe us than not. Sorry, I got impatient and pushed the button too many times, so now we're on the right slide again. We can try to deter use of force, as some argue that we should, through a strategy designed to signal that we're prepared to pay the price of war when it fails. This could entail changing U.S. policy by entering a de facto or a formal defense alliance with the government of Taiwan, or it could entail changing our military posture to pursue a strategy of military denial, posturing the U.S. military to be immediately and unavoidably at war in the event Beijing chooses to use force. Both strategies have to address the challenge of alignment with consequence. Each has to try to signal effectively that the U.S. interest in peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is such that it merits going to war. Generating that signal and making it believable will almost certainly mean tying our hands, posturing ourselves such that we're immediately at war, and in fact that we can't escape or avoid that war when deterrence fails. An alternative to trying to deter a use of force by signaling that we're prepared to pay the price of war is to signal that we're prepared to pay the price of breaking the global economy. Such a strategy would involve designing military, economic, and diplomatic responses that dramatically diminish China's access to and role in globalized trade. Or we could choose any one of many other strategies that aren't as painful for us when they fail. The U.S. interest in peaceful resolution of the cross-strait dispute hasn't changed, but of course some things have. Taiwan's role in the global economy, China's role in the global economy, and China's military capabilities all have changed. And these changes mean that the price that the United States and the world will pay if deterrence fails has changed. The price is now much higher than it was before. This should force us to ask ourselves how much downside risk we're really willing to accept. Just how important is peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait to the security and prosperity of the American people? Is it vital enough that we're ready to pay the price of total conventional war, one where we have to shoot our way in, suffer enormous casualties once we get there, and fight while standing on a slippery slope to nuclear war? Is it vital enough that we're ready to pay the price of global economic shock, crisis, and reconfiguration? Or is it important but not as vital as all of that? These are not rhetorical questions. All strategies of deterrence, this button really doesn't like me, I'm sorry. It's trying to tell me something. So those weren't rhetorical questions. All strategies of deterrence really might fail. Our strategy to deter Beijing from using force against Taiwan, no matter what that strategy is, might fail. And if it does, policymakers will have to explain to the voting public why accepting the costs of that failure are necessary, why they chose a strategy that requires the nation, for example, to endure supply chain disruptions and price increases, or to explain why they chose a strategy that requires the nation to endure supply chain disruptions and price increases, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, the loss of U.S. service members in an ocean 7,000 miles away from home, in a war that might become World War III and end in nuclear Armageddon. We can't make sure deterrence holds, and so we have to have answers to these questions, because those are the questions and the answers that have to guide the design of our strategy of deterrence. The failure mode that we choose is how we convey our credibility. It's how we tell China something about ourselves, and it's how we give Beijing reason to believe it. Thanks for tolerating my bad button clicking, and I'll look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Melanie. That was a great setting of the context and a reminder of some of the history and background that goes into this very difficult and challenging and complex deterrence issue that the United States and others current, and Taiwan certainly currently facing. Now, to a China focus here, I'm David Logan on Chinese nuclear expansion and modernization.
Good morning. Thanks to all of you for being here. It's good to be back at the Naval War College and see some friendly faces. So I've been asked to talk about China's nuclear modernization and expansion, and I've divided the talk into 4 sections. So first, I think it's important to have a good understanding of how are China's nuclear forces and strategy changing in terms of size, sophistication, and posture. And we actually have pretty good information about this. But then second, I'll talk a little bit about some of the existing uncertainty about China's nuclear future and why I think we should be cautious in extrapolating current trends to future endpoints. Third, I'll hypothesize a little bit about some of the potential drivers of China's ongoing nuclear shifts, and then I'll conclude with some implications and tentative recommendations. So first, how are China's nuclear forces changing? The first and most significant change, and the one that has attracted the most attention, I think, in popular discussions, is the significant increase as illustrated on the figure here. This line plots the size of China's nuclear warhead stockpile from 1964 until today, and we can see that starting around 2013, there's been a significant increase. So in 2013, China was estimated to have roughly 200 nuclear warheads. Today, that number is around 500, based on estimates from both the Defense Department and independent non-government analysts. One way that we can appreciate how unprecedented this quantitative expansion in China's nuclear forces is that in less than 10 previous years, China's nuclear warhead stockpile has grown by more than it did in its first 50 years as a nuclear armed state. In addition to the increase in the nuclear warhead stockpile, China has grown the size of its rocket force, increasing the number of brigades in the last several years from 29 to more than 40. It's also expanded other elements of its nuclear forces, including fielding 6 nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, reassigning a nuclear mission to the PLA Air Force, and beginning work on a next generation strategic nuclear bomber. The Defense Department has not only provided us estimates of where China's nuclear forces are today, but where they might be in the future. These include additional predictions that by 2026, China might possess 200 warheads on ICBMs capable of striking the continental United States. By 2027, that China might possess 700 total deliverable nuclear warheads, and that if the current pace of expansion were to continue, that China might possess 1,000 warheads by 2030. Though, as I'll discuss later, I think there are some reasons that we should be cautious about predicting the specifics of China's nuclear forces in the future. In addition to the growing size of the force, China has also significantly improved its sophistication. In the last decade, China has deployed a suite of advanced nuclear technologies. This includes multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, advanced precision strike systems, hot swappable dual capable systems that can quickly move from conventional to nuclear armament in the field. It also includes mobile missile launchers with off-road capability that are harder to track and target. And it also includes work to develop and deploy an advanced command and control and ISR infrastructure to support a larger, more diversified, and more advanced nuclear arsenal. We've also seen reports in recent years that China has constructed 2 upgraded versions of its SSBNs. These supposedly benefit from more advanced quieting technologies and also are equipped with a longer range and potentially MIRV-capable submarine-launched ballistic missile. Finally, in addition to the increasing size and sophistication of the force, there's evidence that China might also be considering changing how it postures these forces, how it operates them. First, there are enduring concerns about the credibility of China's no first use policy. These are not entirely new, but I think some of the concerns in the United States have become more heightened in recent years. These include questions like, for example, would China consider a demonstration nuclear strike or a signaling strike using a nuclear weapon as acceptable under its no first use policy? Would the policy continue to hold if China believed that its nuclear forces were under threat from conventional attacks by an adversary? And how would China's political leadership respond if it believed that losing a conventional conflict meant serious political instability at home? There's also evidence of rocket force missile brigades, including nuclear-armed ones, having higher reaction times than in the past. In the past, it was believed that China's nuclear forces trained to respond to a nuclear strike on the order of days or weeks, but we now have reports from retired rocket force commanders suggesting that response times can now be measured in hours or minutes, and the Department of Defense suggests that some rocket force brigades conduct what is known as combat readiness duty and high alert duty, including assigning missile battalions to be ready to launch on short notice. In the past, it was believed that China kept its nuclear warheads stored separately from their delivery systems, but the fielding of a sea leg and the placing of some rocket force brigades on high alert introduces the technical requirements to attach warheads to missiles in port or at launch sites. And then finally, there is evidence that China, reportedly with assistance from Russia, is investing in the infrastructure necessary for an early warning system, which has raised concerns that China might move to a launch on warning posture in the future. Finally, some of this potential for a shift in how China postures its nuclear forces can also be seen in how China talks about nuclear weapons. Historically, Chinese writings and statements from senior leadership only ascribed 3 purposes to nuclear weapons. These were 1, to prevent nuclear blackmail against China from other nuclear armed powers, 2, to deter nuclear strikes against China, and 3, to retaliate for nuclear strikes in case deterrence failed. But in the last several years, some Chinese writings, including from academics and strategists associated with the PLA, suggest that nuclear weapons may be capable of doing more. These include views that nuclear weapons may bolster China's prestige and status as a great power and technologically advanced nation, views that nuclear weapons may deter and control the outbreak and escalation of conventional crises and conflicts, and also views that they may enhance global perceptions of China's resolve and comprehensive national power. And in all of these statements, we're seeing an expansion, perhaps, of the utility and role assigned to China's nuclear forces. Now, we have good evidence about how China's nuclear hardware has changed, especially in the last several years, and we maybe have some evidence about possible shifts in posture going forward, but there are significant challenges to predicting China's nuclear future and also to understanding why some of these shifts are happening. First, there is uncertainty about some elements of the recent force expansion. One of the most high-profile elements of this expansion has been China's construction of more than 300 new missile silos at 3 sites in the heartland of the country. But there still remains significant uncertainties about how these missile silos would be operated. What missiles would they be filled with? Would they be filled with missiles? And there's been a debate in the United States about, for example, whether or not China might adopt a so-called shell game, filling some of the silos with real missiles, filling others with dummies or decoys to act as a sponge. And the image on the right actually comes from a report written by strategists affiliated with the PLA rocket force in which they assess the strengths of this kind of deceptive basing mode. So depending on our assumptions about how many of the silos are filled with missiles, whether those missiles are armed with multiple warheads can significantly affect our conclusions about how many warheads and how many delivery systems China actually operates. Our past experience with predicting China's nuclear future should also serve somewhat as a cautionary tale. We in the United States have a history of overestimating China's future nuclear growth. So on the slide here, I've put 3 figures from a declassified 1974 intelligence estimate that was meant to predict how China's nuclear forces would grow in the future. The first 2 figures are for estimates of land-based delivery systems, and the third is for sea-based delivery systems in the form of SSBNs. The black lines estimate how these number of delivery systems would look from 1974 to 1985, and the red dotted line that I've added is the actual number of Chinese systems that were deployed in 2010. There's many examples like this that we can see even from the last several decades of elements of the U.S. overestimating China's future nuclear expansion. And this doesn't mean that China's nuclear forces have not expanded. They certainly have. And it doesn't mean that they won't continue to expand. They very likely will. The question is, what will they look like at some point in the future? We also face significant analytical challenges. These include reduced access to Chinese writings and experts, increased internal controls on information within China to the point that many Chinese nuclear experts themselves lack good information about the buildup, the deterioration of US-China dialogues, and some inherent ambiguity about the indicators of China's nuclear modernization and expansion. Some of the visible changes that we've seen can be explained by multiple different drivers. And with that, I think it's helpful to look at what are some of the potential drivers explaining China's ongoing modernization and expansion. Here are 6 possible explanations: assuring survivability, seeking status for both domestic and international audiences, using nuclear weapons to serve as a nuclear shield and help with escalation control in a conventional crisis or a conflict. Perhaps the modernization and expansion is the result of bureaucratic politics in which domestic constituencies invested in China's nuclear future gain more influence over strategic decisions. It may be the result of technological determinism, in which China simply fields more systems and more advanced systems because it can. Or perhaps from the US perspective, the most pessimistic explanation could be that China is aiming for nuclear primacy and is adopting a nuclear warfighting strategy. I'll, for the sake of time, save some of the details, but based on my own work and the work of others, I think that the first 3 are the most plausible: assuring survivability, seeking status, and trying to control escalation. China has a long history of anxieties about the survivability of its strategic nuclear forces, particularly in the face of potential conventional strike systems developed by the United States and U.S. allies and partners, and also concerns about U.S. ballistic missile defense capabilities and what those might mean for the survivability and penetrability of China's strategic nuclear forces. So finally, what does this mean? A couple of tentative implications about the consequences of the modernization and expansion. So one is, I think it clearly, we should expect that it will bolster China's resolve and limit its susceptibility to US nuclear threats. A larger, more sophisticated, more alerted nuclear force means a nuclear force that is more survivable and one that Chinese leaders can have more confidence in, even in the face of potential threats. Two, it increases the risk of conventional conflict and possibly the importance of the conventional military balance. If China believes that it can launch conventional aggression without being concerned about nuclear threats and intimidation, then it may be more willing to do so, and this also places more premium on the conventional correlation of forces. Three, it perhaps increases the possibility of deliberate nuclear escalation by China simply because China has more options, more hardware with which it can signal in the nuclear domain. But four, I think it also reduces the possibility of inadvertent nuclear escalation by China. Many of our models about inadvertent nuclear escalation begin with an assumption that a nuclear-armed state has a nuclear force that is not survivable, and that leaders in that state may face pressures to use it before they lose it. A Chinese nuclear force that is more survivable means a Chinese nuclear force that is less likely to face these kinds of escalation pressures. Finally, it also potentially increases domestic constituencies supporting nuclear weapons, which could serve as a reinforcing mechanism, encouraging future nuclear expansion and modernization in China. I see my time is almost up, and I was told before I started that I might get kicked if I went over, so that's deterrence in action. I'll skip the last slide and turn it back over to Terry. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. That adds some really important information and data as we think about the future of China's nuclear force and the implications and such that go along with that, and how deterrence fits in for what is an important debate about what does this mean and how should the United States respond. And so now we turn to our last speaker, Eric Lynn Greenberg, who will address technology and deterrence, another challenging issue as we look at the many different permutations and elements of this. Eric.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to join you all this morning. Dr. Roehrig asked me to talk about a range of technologies and how they affect the future of deterrence. One can imagine that you could study a single technology for months or years, and we have 15 minutes, probably 14, if I can follow the lead of my other colleagues here. So what we're gonna do today is a little bit of speed dating with emerging technologies and deterrence. So much like speed dating, you're not gonna get to meet everyone, and you're not gonna learn everything about everyone. But I think the big takeaway that I hope folks will walk away from the discussion with is that the fundamentals of deterrence remain unchanged regardless of what technologies are involved. At the end of the day, what changes, though, are perhaps the means and tools and perhaps the speed and actors involved in deterrence. So let me follow my colleague's lead in talking a little bit about the definition of deterrence. I, too, apparently am having technology issues. All right, so deterrence, right, at the end of the day is about shaping the behavior of a rival. It's about showing them how much they will hurt if they were to carry out some type of action. So you might punish them or show them that their actions are going to be futile. At the end of the day, though, what's critical about deterrence is that there's a few types of deterrence, and we'll talk about these in a few minutes, but you could deter by punishment, so showing someone that if they were to do something, they would suffer massive punishment, and that those costs would likely outweigh whatever gains they're going to have. You can have deterrence by denial, which again is showing people that their actions are going to be futile, they will be defeated. And then you have this notion of deterrence by detection. And what we mean here is that you can reveal information that will either enable actors to punish an adversary or to deny them. Underlying all of these different types of deterrence, however, is this notion that capability and credibility are incredibly important. So credibility is simply that, right? I will follow through with a threat that I've made, and capability is that I have the ability to do this. All right. And then beyond this, what's also quite important is that there needs to be a clear line between the sender of the threat and the receiver. If I'm the receiver and I don't know who's sending a deterrent threat, I'm likely not going to be deterred. And if I am the state that's trying to deter, I send a message and it's unclear who the receiver is, they might not get that message. So here are the folks that you'll meet during your speed dating round today. So it's social media. We'll talk a little bit about open source intelligence. We'll talk about remotely operated systems, and then very briefly touch on artificial intelligence, because I think my colleagues did a great job touching on that this morning. So if we think about social media can be used in a number of different ways. What I want to focus on here, though, is the use of social media to send a signal. And so to do this, I'll take you back to January of 2020, right? The United States had just carried out a targeted killing of Major General Qasem Soleimani, and former President Trump, as he often did, took to Twitter, and he issued a deterrent threat. He said that a number of targets in Iran would be struck if the Iranians retaliated for the killing of General Soleimani. Many of Trump's critics said, hey, you shouldn't be issuing these threats over Twitter. This is a serious topic, and Twitter is not an area for serious threats to be made. But it's not just President Trump that was issuing threats over Twitter. Over 200 world leaders have Twitter accounts, use these for signaling foreign policy messages. We'll see another tweet here from the Russian Foreign Ministry, deterrent threat against the United Kingdom in 2018. So the question here is essentially, are these threats credible? If we're issuing a threat via social media, can we believe it? Is it going to be similar to a threat that's issued via some other type of means? So let's dive in really quickly to International Relations 101. Most IR scholars will tell you that what makes a threat credible is either that it ties hands or sinks costs. So from a sinking cost perspective, what we mean here is that you're investing heavily either in lives, material, or dollars in a way that you would only do if you were going to follow through with that threat. And tying hands, you're making a public and visible statement in which you'll suffer consequences if you were to back down on that. So the question then is, if we go back to January of 2020, were President Trump's threats credible? His critics will say no. Less than a week after he issued those threats via Twitter, what did Iran do? They carried out an airstrike on Al-Assad, or missile strike on Al-Assad Air Base. And his critics said, well, this tweet didn't actually deter Iranian action. If he had been more forceful, action might have been deterred. But the problem here is that we only see one state of the world. We only see the state of the world in which President Trump issued a tweet. And this is something that political scientists call the fundamental problem of causal inference. We only see one state of the world. So how do political scientists study this? We run experiments. So a Ph.D. student and I ran this experiment that you see on the screen. We recruited about 2,000 respondents. These are a mix of folks within the United States, members of the public, and then a really elite sample of national security policymakers here in the US, India, and Singapore. And we present them with a hypothetical situation in which President Biden issues a threat. Half of that sample is told that the threat is issued via tweet. The other half is told that the threat is issued via a traditional White House statement. So just by a show of hands, how many people think that the tweet was viewed as less credible? Okay, so a good number of you. What we actually find is that there is no difference between a tweet and an official statement. And we say, okay, maybe this is a fluke. We rerun this experiment multiple times. We change the president, so we vary whether it's President Biden or President Trump. We have the Ayatollah Khomeini issuing threats to the United States, and we see the same results. So regardless of what means these threats are issued through, they're viewed as equally credible. So let's move to another technology here, and this is open source intelligence technologies. We live in a world today where there's essentially far fewer secrets than there were in the past. And whether that's because of commercial overhead imagery that can reveal Russian convoys on the outskirts of Kyiv, or positional data of a US ISR aircraft being broadcast on the internet, or a Russian air defense artilleryman, putting out pictures of himself on Instagram for all to see that he's actually located in Ukrainian territory. All of these result in a world that is far more transparent than the world that we live in today. So a good friend of mine, Theo Milanopoulos, who's in the back of the room, also a faculty member in the National Security Affairs Department, and I are working on a book that explores what we call the transparency dilemma. So essentially deterrence in a world where there's far fewer secrets than in the past. So on one hand, this new type of transparency is incredibly helpful for the US to deter adversaries. We can use this to deter adversaries, to name and shame them, to deny them and punish them. But at the same time, our adversaries can use the same type of intelligence information against us. And the core of this is states no longer control what we call the disclosure decision. This information is now openly available to actors from across the board, whether it's a private company, whether it's a 17-year-old sitting in their basement tweeting out information about the status of their disposition of forces. States no longer have this monopoly on intelligence information. So how is this useful for us? If we go back to those core elements of capability in deterrence, this type of information can help both to punish and deny. So from a denial standpoint, we can share intelligence information very easily with partners and allies that might not be part of traditional intelligence sharing agreements, or we can just publicly release it, makes targeting a bit easier. You can also use this to punish adversaries. So in the bottom right-hand corner here, you see an image of Chinese internment facilities in Xinjiang. The US government, along with think tanks, released a good deal of open source intelligence on this to really generate a naming and shaming campaign, and also to generate international support for US sanctions against the People's Republic of China. But just as this information is incredibly helpful for us, it also is probably problematic and allows other actors to deter us. It ties the hands of US decision-making when you can have a young soldier or sailor running around a base with a Fitbit, identifying the location of bases that we might not want public. And we know, based on public reporting now, that our adversaries that might not traditionally have the ability to hold the US at risk can rely on this information to hold US assets at risk. So that retaliatory strike that we talked about early on, where you had the Iranians striking US bases in Iraq, open source intelligence was used to help the Iranians target that. So again, it shows you some of the challenges here with open source intelligence. Moving on to the next speed date is remotely operated systems. And I realize that none of the assets on the board here are remotely operated, right? They all have a crew member on board. And that's precisely part of the message. When the United States seeks to shape the behavior of our adversaries, one of the first things that we do is we take you, the men and women who wear the cloth of our nation, and put them in harm's way to show that we both have the capability to rapidly deploy military capability, but also to show credibility, that we have skin in the game. And so when North Korea rattles its nuclear sabers, Kim Jong-un gets a really cool free air show off the coast of Korea. And then something that many of you are engaged with, right? When China exercises excessive maritime claims, you have freedom of navigation operations. All of these involve putting skin in the game. But what happens when your assets start to look a little bit different? What happens when there is no crew member on board? How does that shape a rival's behavior and their response to that? So if you have unmanned autonomous systems, what happens when an adversary starts attacking those systems? How do you respond, and how do you reestablish deterrence? What happens if you have a platform like the B-21 Raider, which the Air Force has now publicly acknowledged will be an optionally manned asset? What happens if that air defense operator on the other side doesn't know if there's a US pilot crew member on board the aircraft? How does that shape their decision-making logic? And we know our adversaries are far more likely to engage unmanned assets than manned assets. The IRGC Air Defense Commander, who oversaw the shoot-down of a US Navy RQ-4 in 2019, has publicly said that they could have targeted a P-8, but they chose not to do that. They wanted to send a strong signal by engaging an unmanned aircraft without the escalation concerns associated with shooting down a manned platform. But what happens if an adversary continually shoots down unmanned aircraft? What does deterrence look like in that world? How do we reestablish deterrence? And it's not just us that's using these assets, right? Our adversaries, both state and non-state, are using these types of technologies as well. And we talked yesterday about this cost exchange ratio, where we're using and expending incredibly expensive assets, SM-2s, SM-6s, AMRAAMs, AIM-9s, to take down really, really inexpensive things. How do we think about reshaping our adversaries' decision-making logic to make them realize that continuing these strikes is not worth their dime? And then very briefly on artificial intelligence, since I think I have 1 minute left, right? We saw in the briefings both yesterday and today that artificial intelligence is used in a number of applications. One of the topics that came up pretty significantly this morning is the ability of artificial intelligence to make the kill chain faster. And we often think this is a good thing. We say it increases a commander's decision space, but does it actually, right? If a commander is receiving multiple streams of intelligence, multiple streams of information, is their decision space actually contracted? So I want to take us back very briefly for an example, the Cuban Missile Crisis. On October 27, 1962, Major Rudolph Anderson was shot down in a U-2 over Cuba. If you drive about an hour north to the JFK archives, you can sit and read the meeting minutes that one of you, a future action officer, took, right, of the Joint Chiefs debating on how they would respond to this shoot down. And what they needed was time. They decided that they would hold off until the next day before making their decision. Does AI enable that, or does it make it harder for us to do that? So at the end of the day, the fundamentals of deterrence remain the same, regardless of the technologies involved. Some things do change, though. Perhaps speed matters. Perhaps you have new actors involved in the game. And I realized that my presentation probably raised a whole bunch of questions and didn't really provide all that many answers. But you all have the next 10 months to think about these things. You have the time and bandwidth to read, think, and write. And when you go off to your next assignments, whether it's back in the fleet or at a headquarters staff, hopefully you'll go back with some answers to these questions. So thanks so much. Looking forward to the conversation. Feel free to reach out if I can ever do anything.
Thank you very much, Eric. I think your presentation points to a really important discussion that goes on in the deterrence community of what value does theory and our concepts about deterrence tell us and provide guidance for us going forward. And I think your presentation lays out a very good argument for those basics are still crucial in thinking about it, but gosh, there's a lot of new stuff coming down the road that we need to think more carefully about how those things apply.